Good evening all, and thank you for that warm and generous introduction, Sebastian. I'm delighted to be here with you today, here many times in the German Northwest. In particular, I have a particular fondness for MECS. It's a place where a community of really bright, interesting, super smart people gather, and we do lots of work together. I also just love the climate and environment, and again, just wanted to briefly enthuse about the chance that I have to be here. It's a genuine thrill. Just as a brief description, I'm here for about 12 weeks in total, and I'm going to go through a metamorphosis in about a week. For the last 5 weeks and one more week, I'm going to be an entire monastic, all riding all day, and then my family arrives in a week. And I look forward to transforming into a socially aware person at that point, but not until then. Although it won't keep me from asking quite unabashedly, if there's anybody who happens to have an extra bicycle around, do come talk to me afterwards, because I am looking for bikes for the family as a way of getting around town. So let's see, I'm going to offer exactly as Sebastian so beautifully and generously introduced a kind of hop, skip, and jump through my current book project, which is very much a project under construction. So you have a chance to change it dramatically. Here is, this has been written but unread. I printed it off today. This is the third chapter in a 5-chapter book that I'm going to briefly describe to you today. So if you want a little bit more of the meat, please ignore. I mean, there's lots of stuff that's missing there, but you'll see. Just hand it around if people are interested. So let's start broadly in the present. I don't think that this group will be surprised to hear that artificial intelligence or machine learning currently faces a number of interesting problems. I'd like to propose one of my own for you. I'm going to call this the Turing taste test. Right? So given nothing more than image, can you distinguish your pet from your lunch? There's something here, by the way, about embodiment and taste as a tactile sense that supersedes the normal sort of Turing text-based test. I think there's lots of other problems that we're well aware of. We've probably all heard a little bit about the dove situation throughout 5 provinces in China, a social credit monitoring system, widespread use of surveillance cameras, spies, spyware, Wi-Fi sniffers, biometric data collection, all of which is being processed algorithmically through machine learning. Of course, we also already know, this group doesn't need reminding, the widespread reports on bias within machine learning, misidentifying, particularly in the American context, African-American faces, and then also wrongly judging black defendants as more likely of repeating minor offense, and thus justifying algorithmically unjustly severe punishments. We also probably know a little bit about Amazon's facial recognition, and I think the K there is just perfect sci-fi moment. Algorithm which misidentified, that's where the joke lies, the misidentification of 28 members of Congress as belonging to a database of profiles of people who have been charged with crimes and arrest records. And not only that, but misidentified with a false positive rate of 40% among non-white members and only 5% among white members. So in short, I think we know our curious situation. A recent opinion poll in the US surveyed the American public and found actually widespread disappointment and pessimism about most of our major institutions, education, healthcare, corporations, government. But there was 2 moments of outstanding brightness and optimism: artificial intelligence and biotech. What do we as media scholars do with such a situation? The future of AI clearly is not only bright and shiny. This group, I don't think, needs reminders of the many, many problems that can arise in contemporary machine learning. How do we, I wonder, check ourselves and balance the hype and the promise with the dread and the pessimism? How do we keep ourselves from endlessly repeating the cycle of misplacing our dread and our fears as well as our hopes? I don't know, but the project that I'm going to try to describe today is, in short, an effort in reimagining AI. It's an effort in trying to get outside of ourselves, interrogating the metaphors that we use, and considering what types of eternal vigilance we need to bring to our imagination of AI. I understand artificial intelligence, currently anyways, as basically three things. One, it's math, which is basically, like, this can get complicated, but basically a least squares fit optimization technique that is then made trivially complex, right? That's been wrapped up in post-human philosophy and narrative, which is then, and here you really have to come visit me in the Tulsa Fair sometime, deep fat fried in techno-capitalism and the brisk advertisements of techno-capitalism. So here you can see some advertisements for AI at the bottom. There's some overfitting and fitting of data. My project hopes to make some interventions in our contemporary imagination, and it first seeks to do so by turning to materials from the Eastern Bloc, and namely to peel back the techno-capitalism to see what remains in an age of AI research. Second, it also seeks to articulate what may be our most pressing challenge and imagination moment in the contemporary AI scene, which is, instead of imagining AI as post-human, here largely on the left, but still in a human shape, what would it mean to imagine artificial intelligence as genuinely non-human or inhuman? Taking insight from Smart Urban Infrastructures, or the Anatomy of AI project by Kate Crawford, or the stochastical technical structures and insights of databases themselves. How could we reimagine AI, and with it the media theory of artifice, as well as the ethics implied in intelligence, as terms that would never fit what we basically hold as our two standards. AI that would never be subject to a Turing test. It could never fit in that cubicle. Or rather, it becomes the cubicle itself. The intelligent actor is not a person of either gender or a machine or an animal. It is, in fact, the intelligent cubicle. Or how could we imagine a form that would never encounter the uncanny valley, right? It goes the other way. Something in Searle's famous Chinese room experiment, I think, speaks to this. So what I'd like to do here is give you a brief snapshot of the two chapters that I'm writing at the moment. And then I'll briefly describe the project in general, and then offer a few propositions. Okay. So the project in general has five chapters at the moment, and I would like to complete a draft by the end of this summer. Today I'm focusing on chapters 3 and 4, but I might as well note briefly that in the first chapter I'm interested in the Wittgensteinian case of the brain, the literal thing that surrounds it, the medium of the mind, of the embodied mind in particular, and I'm using a wide range of resources from anthropology, the philosophy of mind, and embodiment ethics to think about what it means to take AI's invitation to think about us as cerebral subjects and to reverse it and say, what if we're cranial subjects first, right? How do we think about the place of the brain in the body? The second chapter, I'm trying to gently kill off the founding fathers of artificial intelligence, simply by letting them die. That is, I'm narrating their own encounters in the end of life with their technologies and their work legacies. And in many cases, it seems to be an invitation to check the implicit understanding of AI as a kind of male self-reproduction fantasy. But this is something I'm trying to do gently and without being mean to people. But I think it's implicit in the biographies. And then in the fifth chapter, which I have yet to get around, I have a bunch of notes, but I'm trying to rethink smartness as an embodiment condition. Here the German smart is, the word smart in English, ow, that smarts, is related to Schmerz, of course. And I think there's a kind of etymological opportunity to think about Schmerzmedien and to be thinking about the embodied conditions and the places of embodiment that our smart media put us in touch with. I have a short essay on that if you'd like to hear more. So for now, let's turn to the third and fourth chapters, effectively a tentative alternative genealogy to artificial intelligence. I think the key themes to watch for here are basically the metaphors for mind and the historical role of crisis, scarcity, and war in shaping the sense of self that emerges in AI research. Okay, so the first comment is that Soviet AI, as I'm seeing it, is neither good nor old-fashioned, which means it often doesn't work, but also its tenets tend to be useful at present. Nor does it resemble what the philosopher John Hogland called good old-fashioned AI, which is a classic term for describing what was kind of the emergent and dominant tradition of symbolic AI in the late 50s, mid-60s, and early 70s in most English language literature. Good old-fashioned AI, in this case, participates in a Hobbesian Enlightenment tradition that imagines cognition as the manipulation of symbols, thinking as a kind of computation. So other than that, what does the Soviet AI tradition offer? Two chapter titles. One is a tradition that I'm describing, I just handed this one out to you, the radiant mind tradition. Here I'm trying to describe the Soviet situation in a way that both is in conversation with and also contrasts with what the intellectual historian Jamie Cohen Cole describes as the notion of the open mind. The open mind for him characterizes the mid-century American think tank intellectual milieu. It is effectively a space of collaboratories where individual experts gather into interdisciplinary conferences, and as nodes in a network, they participate in the construction of knowledge. These nodes are often, as described by Cohen Cole, interdisciplinary, centrist, liberal, rational, strategic. And in some ways, I believe that this institutional milieu models the intellectual metaphor for the technologies that emerge out of it, for the computer in particular. So if you think the dashes of the military-industrial academic complexes, the Macy conferences on cybernetics, the ratio clubs, the Dartmouth summer workshops on AI, the MIT Radio Lab and others, Media Lab, these are precisely the institutional form of group work that vaults, ironically, a model of the individual tech genius, or by analogy, the computer as a strategic, rational, individual mind. That's a taking too seriously of the node in the network. And also it continues materials and biographical materials that I discussed in previous chapters. Instead, let's look to what I'm trying to describe as the radiant mind tradition. Here I'm going to start with the so-called Russian cosmists, which is a group that have been romanticized and reinvented after the fact in the post-Soviet period, and whose ideas about science and technology and how they might serve human intelligence, I think arguably give even the wildest Silicon Valley transhumanists a run for their money. So this bearded trinity includes on the left the post-mortal musings of Nikolai Fyodorov. Here are the post-Earth engineerings of the rocketeer and kind of grandfather of the Soviet rocketry mission, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who was briefly a student under Fyodorov. And then less known Vladimir Vernadsky, among the cosmos, but a much more reputable scholar, whose planetary evolutionary theory involves geology, life, and mind, or the geosphere, the biosphere, and the noosphere. And his kind of geochemical approach to what an environment is, I think, proves useful. There's a lot to say. I've tried to write a little bit up here about each of these folks. Let me just turn for a moment, a footnote on Vernadsky. This is the first two paragraphs in Russian of his masterwork from 1926, The Biosphere. I'm going to turn to a couple different translations just as a way of exploring how the words he uses and what type of media theoretic potential they have. So Vernadsky offers a new source for elemental media theory. The word medium here in his work often means something very much like environment. At least it does once we get the translation right. So let's look at two different translations in English of the same paragraphs. You'll notice these two paragraphs are now going to be doubled, right? This is both of those combined, and this is my own literal translation. So this is the English from 98 and my more literal version. You'll see that a couple things happen in English. One, Vernadsky in the original translation seems to sound a little bit like a hooky footnote to countercultural interests in the Gaius hypothesis, which is exactly how he's remembered in English. Announcing the cosmic medium, right? But the text is also much more readable. It's much shorter and compact. You'll notice that the initial version, in fact, leaves out the whole second line, which is a sentence fragment. But in the original, there's a good argument to be made that his theoretic insight is actually far more literal and grounded. Even though in English it sounds kind of highfalutin to say cosmic medium, he's describing simply mirovaya sreda, a world environment. And kosmicheskaya sreda could also be just as easily a space environment. So there's a kind of groundedness that I think that his geochemistry helps us think about. I think, by the way, what happened here is the English translation took more from the Spanish, which precedes it by 2 years, than it does from the Russian. So you can see the same type of movements being made in Spanish 2 years earlier. Looking a little bit, so the point isn't just that the translator is always a traitor, right? But the point is that in Russian, the difference between the word medium and the word environment is usefully very slight. What appears a conceptual insight in English may, in fact, simply be common sense in Russian and in other languages. So sreda means environment. It also means the word Wednesday, which is the time that's in the middle of the week, and ultimately means something like the middle, Mittwoch. Yeah? Srednaya is the adjective for the middle position, which of course draws on the mektaxa, Aristotelian sense of a medium. And sredstva, here the third one, is the plural noun, means the means or the method for articulating what's in the middle of cause and effect, or past and present. Sredstva is also the root of the quintessentially 20th century term the media, which in Russian is rendered sredstva massovой информации, the means of mass information. I think this invitation to think about the means as media and the means as the middle environments of media offers a potential update for the very Slavic tradition that gives us this language. So now I'm going to turn to where I'm getting different metaphors for the mind from the Soviet research environments. The notion across most of this literature is simply that in the early 20th century, a number of different Soviet figures are imagining the mind as a mass medium, and that the brain, it's not a computer or a symbolic manipulator, it is instead radiant in a way that can be understood by looking at public heroes, radios, film, and television. The most obvious case of a radiant mind is none other than the brain and body of Lenin. Here are two institutions, the Mausoleum on Red Square and the Brain Institute in Moscow, that were built to display and study his body and brain respectively. In 1926, 2 years after Lenin's death, Stalin authorizes to the tune of 150,000 rubles the construction of a research institute and hires Oskar Vogt, a major German neuroscientist interested in chiroarchitectonic neuroscience. I think the studies that Vogt carries out of Lenin's brain, which in many ways are interesting, precisely not because the science is correct, but because of the public work and the political work that the study of the great leader's brain does for the Soviet Politburo. In fact, Vogt comes to the point of declaring he's stuck in this hard situation because he's not sure how he must at the same time appease the demands of the Politburo to show that Lenin is a genius, but also do due diligence to his own scientific method. And his basic answer is to identify abnormally large cell lines in the third stratum of the frontal cranial tissue in Lenin's brain, which he then describes, which he assumes, he doesn't know, that this must mean that Lenin was a tion athlete, an association athlete, right? That he was good at making associational leaps. Again, this work is important precisely because, not that it's correct scientifically, but because it's being made to a political body. And the work, this is in short a revision to the common sense mantra of a lot of neuroscience, which is the mind is what the brain does. Well, my argument in this history is that the literal work of the brain is often outside of the head, right? And it's doing political public work in a way that can be recognized as kind of a ritualized emblem within the Soviet history. Let me start with the backward story here. So 70 years later, in 1991, avant-garde artist named Sergei Kurokhin trolls the viewers of post-Soviet television, which is very recently free and open, by arguing how, in an entirely straight-faced, no-nonsense presentation for 2 hours, how Lenin, the human leader, был грибом, was in fact a mushroom, a fleshy, spore-bearing fungus whose main roots and lives were lived underground. The argument here was basically that Lenin had consumed a lot of hallucinogenics as a person and had actually transformed, together with his leadership, into a spore. He did this without breaking a smile. And it was an early act of fake news. It was also a brilliant fulfillment of the at least metaphorical salad topping that the Brain Research Institute had made out of Lenin's literal brain by pickling it and slicing it. Soviet figures also thought about the mind as a radiant mass medium in other ways. For this, some of this research I owe much to Vladimir Veliminsky, our own here, whom I think many of us know, and his essential work on Soviet brainwaves and mind control. But for me, the main point here is that the Western mechanization of mind, even, not just neuroscience, but even psychoanalysis, which takes mental malfunction as a hardware problem in need of filters and tuners. It takes the psychoanalyst as a live phonograph for recording the Lacanian real, does not in fact pathologize our understanding of the brain as a radiant medium. In the way the Soviets instead imagined the radiant medium of the mind as organizing scientific management of labor and even organizational behavior across a collectivist society. Here we see Alexei Gastyev, the bard of scientific management of labor and ergonomics, who was, among other things, an interesting poet. We see his collective body. He saw in the individual worker a cog that could be standardized and brought into synchronization with a factory floor. And that the mental menial workers of the factory floor could be created into a much larger machine that itself would become alive. Vladimir Bekhterev, who we may know as the main rival of Ivan Pavlov, is really a fascinating pan-neurologist who sees, too, the mind as a component in a larger psychological, physiological circuits of the factory floor. Here, Bekhterev also sort of fascinatingly describes the world through what he calls, reflex theory, but does so in a way that gives a kind of a metaphysics to what he calls hidden energy. And this hidden energy has a role of both being able to be described mechanically, scientifically, as the Soviet revolutionary period demand, but also allowing minds to be something more than mechanisms. Nikolai Bernstein, who had followed both of them in some of the same institutes, also developed a notion of human motor mechanics that did a similar type of work. In his case, it framed the central nervous system of the human body as a microcosm for the role of the socialist state in society. Namely, both the central nervous system and the Soviet state would coordinate certain and would freeze certain degrees of freedom, thus permitting coordinated action in a way that in its statistical work actually anticipates Bayesian machine learning. The notions of the Soviet collectivist society as participating in radiant, interacting minds includes many other senses. An Armenian inventor, Ovanes Abramovich Adamyan, gives the mass mind eyes by developing and innovating and patenting a number of techniques for dolnovidение or far-seeing, Fernsehen, right? Color, as well as early attempts in color television. But I think, so for Velminsky, these and other people culminate in an overarching interest in telepathy, who for him is best exemplified in Pavel Gulayev, an obscure cyberneticist who publishes in 1965 The Material Foundations of Telepathy. But for me, I think the much more persuasive argument is actually found in the everyday science, such as the mainstream cyberneticist Viktor Glushkov, who is also interested in similar activities, a kind of metaphysical, resonant notion of mind, which he develops into the OGAS network, the network that my first book describes. But he does so not based off of the image of computers, but off of radios, which he grows up among another class of radiolubiteli, radio enthusiasts, tinkerers, playing with and learning early engineering skills by working, in short, on the radio. So in many ways that I think continues a late Victorian tradition, but under the new scientific politics of the socialist state, we see throughout the mind as a private machine meant for public synchronization and tuning. The Soviet citizen is, in short, a radio head. The radio itself plays an oversized architectural and artistic role. Consider the hyperbolic 19th century design of Shukhov radio tower. Here he's building off of 19th century interest in steel. And he builds this, as early as 1890, he starts proposing designs like this, which bear kind of symbolically in Moscow today, this Shukhov radio tower bears both the ethereal reach of the electromagnetic waves of radio, which it is designed after, as well as surprisingly little tons of steel. Right? So this weight and weightlessness are combined at the same time. In 1921, 1 year before this tower was built, the radical Cubo-futurist poet Velimir Khlebnikov wrote an extraordinary poem. If you don't know him, check it out. The Radio of the Future, Radio Budushevo. And there he describes the radio tower as the central brain of society, warning that, quote, the least disruption of capital R radio operations would produce a mental blackout over the entire country, a temporary loss of consciousness. Here again, I think we can begin to discern a non-pathologized vision of the Homo Sovieticus as a radiohead, or as a thought broadcaster, as the DSM puts it. Those whose skulls are not so much vats for philosophy of mind hypotheticals, so much as they are acoustical chambers, amplifiers, and repeaters, combined with the radio towers to form in human and machine networks alike sredstva massovой информации, or media for coordinating labor, intelligence, and radiant environments. Another moment of radio, consider the voice of Radio Moscow, Yuri Borisovich Levitan, a man who is said to have spoken with the voice of Stalin at the height of the war. Something that the Nazis apparently agreed with, and that they named him the public enemy number one, offering a bounty. Goebbels' plan was anybody who could bring him alive to Berlin would make Levitan read the announcement of the capitulation of the Soviets out loud on radio for December 1941. When that failed, they just said, okay, he's our number one enemy now. We're going to kill him first and then Stalin. And I think the reason for this kind of the forcefulness of his voice and the political power that it had speaks to an age of mass media. The only mass medium that I can speak of that I can think of that spoke with more mass address, more anonymous a reach, and more force is precisely the medium, if you would, that ended World War II, the nuclear bomb. Here I follow Akira Lippitz's Atomic Light, or Shadow Optics book, who sees the nuclear bomb as the culmination of the cinematic broadcast message that makes a flash screen of the heavens, whose light is so bright it sears matter, and also constitutes a pivot point between the mass medium of cinema and the digital age of cybernetics. A flash that happens so quickly, 67 nanoseconds, that it requires previously incalculable timescales of computation. So I think what I'm hoping here is this brief description is supposed to set up a schematic impression of an alternative tradition for imagining smart tech, not as cybernetic computer brains or as Helmholtz's or Spencer's or Cooley's telegraph networks, but instead as the concurrent radiant mass media, whose brain images are not anthropocentric, not human, they're not limited to the event horizon of the human skull or self. The next latter half of the 20th century, the Nylon Heart, and this material is much more recent. I'm recently returning from Kiev 2 months ago and gathering my notes as I try to describe the tradition of искусственный интеллект, künstliche Intelligenz, or artificial intelligence in the latter half of the 20th century. And in particular, for archival access reasons, I'm looking at the Institute of Cybernetics in Kiev. So the Nylon Heart is the name of a folk song, actually, written in 1968 from the movie Мужской разговор. I'm going to not read it to you now, but just or play it now, but rehearse a couple of the lyrics. It says, "They say that one day there will be a nylon heart. They say in 200 years. Maybe science can do it reasonably, but for us guys, it won't come to anything. A nylon heart does not hurt, it does not beat. No, it is definitely not for us to live without hearing or seeing. And even if there is a nylon heart," it concludes, "we will teach it to worry. We will make it worry." So where does this idea of the nylon heart come from? I trace it to this folklore of the nylon heart to Nikolai Amosov, a Soviet surgeon who's remembered today as a socialist hero for having trained on the triage floors of World War II and performing as many as 30,000 operations over a 60-year career in surgery. The Nylon Heart story originates apparently in October of 1957, when at the age of 44, Amosov visits a heart surgery conference in Mexico City. And by the way, I don't know if he's interacting with Arturo Rosenbluth, whose Heart Research Institute is where Norbert Wiener wrote Cybernetics a decade earlier in Mexico City, but I hope to find out. In any case, Amosov becomes convinced at this conference, that what he sees in action at the operating table is the future of heart surgery, the CPB bypass machine, or the artificial respirator and circulation machine. That this was the future of open chest, lung, and heart surgery. But Amosov also recognized that Moscow may have had one, but Kiev, where he lived, certainly didn't. In fact, it didn't even have the synthetic polymer or nylon from which he would be able to stitch and sew heart valves. So his thinking began modestly. He left the conference. He used his $15 per diem to buy shirts from the market square and then brought home nylon shirts from which he sewed heart valves. Here I read Amosov's modest beginning as encountering a series of cybernetic growths, and it becomes a much less modest vision of artificial intelligence. For him, the scaling image of artificial intelligence, he becomes an artificial intelligence researcher in the coming years, begins in the operation room. So it begins with inserting synthetic material into the literal heart of the patient, and we can see nylon as a symbol of at least two of the three major circulation metaphors in the 20th century. Blood, petroleum, it's a synthetic material from which nylon is synthesized, but not capital. He has complaints about well-paid doctors, capitalist doctors. Then from there, it scales out to the patient's body, which is encased. His image of AI, it scales out to the patient's body, which is encased in this CPB bypass machine that sustains their breathing and circulation, but only does so for a while before poisoning the patient. This poison that comes from the machine that's going to save you shifts how he thinks about intelligently artificial environments. For indeed, the operation room is an environment in which the surgeon's job is to shift on purpose artificially the boundary between artificial life and artificial death. No longer is there natural life or death involved once you're on that machine. Similarly, the expert tacit non-symbolic knowledge of the surgery team is described in his work. Many of the uttered words are not symbolic, they're phatic, they're swear words, they don't have meanings, he's just angry. Most of reports that his hands work by their own knowledge, as is a common trope among surgeons. He then conceives the operating theater and the prep room outside of it, and even the whole hospital as an institutional smart environment for sustaining artificial life. He does this across a number of works. The scientific ones are on top, his popular literary works are on the bottom. And he does so, I think, usefully without embracing a strong cybernetic romance of the brain and the brain computer as a neuromorphic metaphor for what life or intelligence is. He even tries to formulate a model for correlating balances of psychological personalities and social labor here on the left, in which the larger situation is an environmental situation that is intelligent, that balances society and individual together. You can see variables on the bottom: fitness of body, knowledge, wealth, position, conviction, authority. He's, of course, not the only one working on what we might call an anatomy of artificial intelligence. And in what I've done in the past couple months are dozens of interviews and recently discovered archival documents that are helping me piece together what I'm left with as kind of an emerging impression of artificial intelligence as a disconnected anatomy exercise. So here we see different streams of researchers who are focusing on automating and technologizing different streams of human senses, but they're doing so without an overarching integrating image of the human behind it. So, for example, the logic machine of Anatoly Morozov and Marina Markhavets, who are interested in developing basically a method for automating whether theorems can be proven true or not. You insert a theorem and it would tell you whether you can prove it. Compare that to the much more semantically arranged notion of language in the machine translation of Nadezhda Mishenko. She's interested in translating between the prefixes and suffixes of Russian into the agglomerative morphology of Turkish, which lets you stick stuff in the middle. She's trying to find a machine translation version for working across those, also with this sense of semantic language informing her work. Or the robotechniques of Vitaly Rybak, whose eyes, hands, and recognition machines, poznavania, would interact and manipulate objects without any centralized brain. Here you can see him working in Mexico on the machine for, it's an old sailor's problem. How do you fix the ship when it's already at sea? How do you build a corridor on the International Space Station when it's already built? Well, you have a robot that does this kind of iterative modular work. And here's him trying to imagine that at a much smaller scale. The memory of Boris Malinovsky is fascinating in that he's interested in computer memories. He's one of the leading deans of computer memory research, but he's also writing simultaneously about, he's writing the history of computing, and in particular the history of computing seen through war, which I'll come back to in a second. And others, Vera Bichtan, his daughter, who scale biology from the cell to the city. These, I think, are simply left to what am I doing with this? The point is these different approaches never combine into one synthetic embodied leviathan, The Stanislav Lem's golem disappears. Instead, they meet, if they meet anywhere, in decision theaters and in environments where you can see, here's different decision makers meet, a situation war room, a congress, a pilot air control room, boardrooms, where they integrate different senses, different techniques into an environment. A human-in-the-loop automated environment, knowledge, communication, and deliberation environment. So just as much as the vision of AI as embodied human form disappears in this work, one other type of body disappears in this story as well, which is women's, who, learning in particular from Marie Hicks' recent history, programmed inequalities, and how the ruinous sexism of British computing history ended up not serving the country's long-term interests. I think we can see an interesting fact that most of the people involved in this history, those closest to technical expertise, although rarely management, are women. Almost 50% of the Institute staff, they often disappear from official histories. So, for example, Nadezhda Mishenko, who, in addition to, raises a child underfoot while programming machine translators on her machine table. Or Marina Morakovets, who I mentioned, how she would run her automated theorem programs on the mainframe in the wee morning hours before anyone else would be awake. She was the only one who would get those assignments. And this one I haven't figured out quite yet. There's a leading female researcher who directly and overtly criticized the Institute director, and I can't find where her history is. It seems to have been covered up or dismissed as that of a hard woman, I was repeatedly told. I'm gonna find out the story, because I think it's, I wouldn't be surprised if she has some insight. So in other words, perhaps the image of the body most hidden in the fragmented anatomy of AI is not that of a machine-like, a human-like machine. It's arguably the hidden labor of women. Okay. Here are a couple, I'm going to step back now and offer a few working propositions that I think might help pull together a lot of the material just thrown up onto the wall. Three in particular. So the first is, throughout this history, I see what I'm calling the hermeneutic fertility of modest means. Or in other words, sometimes having less can mean more. There's where you find no computational surplus, there's often theoretical elegance. The Nylon Heart, in both the melodies of folk music and the ambitions of research, emerges from what you can do with $15 per diem. As Michael Lewis has recently argued, the technical elegance of many Soviet computer programmers that went on to shape high finance in Manhattan, the Silicon Alley in Boston, and hacking cultures throughout the post-Soviet spaces owes much to the fact that they often had to learn to program on chalkboards rather than on computers. If you can't throw excess computational power at a problem, you have to solve it by other means. And by the way, an intellectual AI, it seems, and here I don't mean to diminish the genuine tradition of Soviet ecocide, but Soviet AI is actually much better for the environment than industrial AI. So what it means to have less is an important question, particularly under conditions of crisis, revolutions and wars. Second, the radiant mind and the Nylon Heart traditions or metaphors, I think, give us a break from the cybernetic tradition of the human as a robot or the brain as a computer. Instead, they offer ways of imagining intelligence as the coordination of radio waves, organizing individuals in society, which is, again, a much older tradition. And while this isn't not problematic, I mean, there's lots of ways that's a problem, it is at least an alternative to the Enlightenment tradition. I think it also helps reclaim what we tend to dismiss as traditional media today. Shukhov's radio tower, Leviton's radio voice, Adamyan's television, the filmic optics of the atomic bomb, as the genuinely exceptional media that they play in the 20th century. Mass media stand out for their historical exceptionality. And third, why the inhuman imagination behind this? Where does that come from? Some of the intellectual dexterity in imagining what AI might look like in the Soviet tradition, I think follows, I posit, from what Stefanos Gerlanos calls the human body in the age of catastrophe, or the brittleness and fragility of broken bodies. The unit for the individual, the human body, proves enormously fickle, particularly in times of war. Sometimes minor scrapes can kill, where other times the patients outlive the horrors of triage floors. And before, as he argues, post-war, interwar medicine could imagine the whole body as an integrated organism, it had to be confronted with the fact that the best successes of medicine in the 20th century often kept bodies broken. Does that make sense? So like, if you succeed, you keep people from dying, and then broken bodies live on. Amosov, who could amputate a leg in less than a minute, and others experienced the shattering of human form in the trenches and on the battlefronts. I think that they were then compelled to imagine an ideal form of intelligence that is inhuman or not human-like. As Walter Cannon asked in 1926, and Amosov repeated it throughout his war journals, "Why don't we die daily?" he asked. Their integrating answer was environmental, not individual, homeostasis. Walter Cannon is the guy who coins homeostasis behind cybernetics. So again, less is more, alternatives to the computer mind, and broken bodies as a way of getting there. In all, I think my argument might go something like this. Please improve this. Today, the West is busy briskly selling AI as post-human shaped math. There's a lot to learn from that, but I think it also has some short-sightedness. The shape of statistics is stochastic. It's non-human. It's not post-human. It doesn't look like a human. It doesn't look like us. In fact, once we can see all AI through the revolutionary mass society and wartime images of radiant minds, nylon hearts, much else about AI can appear even more inhuman than we may have given it previously credit. So I think Vernadsky might help us here. Perhaps the digital age has advanced AI that combines the geosphere, the rare earth materials, the iron, with the cephalized neural networks of the new sphere, but it has jumped the biosphere. There's nothing about artificial intelligence, it seems, that requires that it take the shape of the biosphere. And for Vernadsky, the biosphere ultimately meant the emergence of animals with heads. Cephalization is the process he describes with hard heads. See the first chapter. That there's nothing about that biosphere that's necessary for the shape of intelligence. Maybe perhaps that we think that intelligence must have some necessary relationship to humans at all is the greatest artifice of our own species and not of AI. So my gambit is that by rethinking this history and finding ways to look outside of it, that we can find both more historically consistent media theoretical materials that bring us into a stochastic inhuman AI image today, while also helping us to separate intelligence from its artificial environments. That is, from the medium, from both the sredstva and the sreda that express it. In light of the Soviet century search for smart environments through the ravages of revolution and war, of course, I think it becomes quite obvious why Amazon's recognition algorithm makes racist profiles. The history of racism and data have always been the artificial environments that inform intelligence. Here I'm imagining the study of AI as the study of artificial environments. So I don't know where this is going to end up, but I think that the results of my project's inquiry may be to reclaim an older or an alternative image of AI as an inhuman artificial environment. It may also offer a refreshed sense of what is human about artificial intelligence. It is that modern humanity is described far better by its inhuman artifices, especially in war and revolution, than it is in its intelligences. And I think we have in the process a fresh chance to hit pause before repeating the endless error of imagining the creatures in the image of their creators. This project is also proving for me, this is just a footnote, but an opportunity for letting me ask, as I've recently done in an article, where in the world is Russian media theory? I think there's ample intellectual lumber, but nowhere does there stand a coherent cabin. And I've been working on trying to pull some of that together. So let me leave you off at last with a quote from the great Marilyn Robinson, who gave a lecture in 2009 on the tradition of mind. Her book is called The Absence of Mind, and she ends it with the following. She says, "Our tiny, teetering, lopsided planet demands a wholly new vocabulary of description for reality at every scale. AI, like the mind for her, I think offers us merely another fable, but it might at least be a fable that encourages an imagination of humankind large enough to acknowledge some small fragment of the mystery that we are." And I hope that our conversation today might begin such a search. Thank you.